The wind, a bitter forerunner of the coming winter, whined through the eaves of the Creed ranch house, a lonely sound in the vast, dark bowl of Red Butte Basin. Inside the main bedroom, the world had shrunk to the unsteady circle of light thrown by a single oil lamp on the nightstand. The flame danced, making the log walls seem to breathe and the shadows in the corners deepen like held secrets. It was a room built for one, smelling of pine, old leather, and the quiet solitude of a man long accustomed to his own company. Rowan Creed sat on the edge of the bed, a man carved from the hard timber and unforgiving rock of the territory itself. A few years shy of 40, he had the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from a profound and lasting weariness. His shoulders were broad, shaped by decades of roping steers and mending fences, yet they slumped with a weight that had nothing to do with physical labor. The top 2 buttons of his chambray shirt were undone, revealing a patch of dark hair and the weathered skin of his throat. His hands, calloused and scarred, rested on his knees. One had started to lift, to reach, but now it hung frozen in the space between them, an unfinished gesture of want or warning. He had not moved for a full minute. Across from him, tucked beneath a heavy wool blanket, was Etta Vale. She was new to Ash Juniper, new to this life, a woman who seemed as out of place in this rough-hewn landscape as a porcelain teacup in a blacksmith shop. Yet, in her eyes, there was a strength that belied her delicate features, a flinty resolve that Rowan had recognized from the moment he'd first seen her. Her auburn hair, unbound, was a splash of defiant color against the white pillowcase. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, a sound meant only for him, lost to the moaning wind outside. "Undo my buttons," she breathed. It was not a command, nor a plea. It was a statement of arrival, an offering. Her breath was a warm, visible plume in the chilled air of the room, but her eyes held a question. They were not the eyes of a seductress, but of a survivor laying down her last weapon. The invitation was steeped in a vulnerability so raw it was almost painful to witness. It was an act of trust, terrifying and absolute. Rowan's throat worked, a dry swallow that made no sound, the scent of her of lavender soap and something else, something uniquely Etta, like prairie dust after a rain filled the small space between them. A simpler man, a younger man, would have seen only the invitation, but Rowan saw the cost of it in her gaze. He saw the ghosts she carried, the walls she had just dismantled, brick by painful brick, to make this offer. "Etta," he said, his voice a low rasp, unused to softness. "We only do what you truly want." His words hung in the air, a counter-offer to her surrender. He was not taking, he was asking. His hand, the one that had been frozen, completed its journey, but not to the delicate pearl buttons of her nightdress. Instead, his rough fingers brushed against the coarse edge of the wool blanket. Gently, with a deliberation that was almost reverent, he pulled it higher, tucking it securely around her shoulders. It was a gesture of protection, not passion, an answer that honored the question in her eyes more than the words on her lips. The lamp flame flickered, casting a long shadow that seemed to pull away from the bed, drawing the very fabric of the moment with it. The tight focus of the room softened, and the scent of lavender and leather faded, replaced by the crisp, metallic tang of snow. The iron-rimmed wheels of a mud-splattered stagecoach crunched through a thin, apologetic dusting of white that coated the main street of Ash Juniper. The town was little more than a raw timber skeleton against the vast, indifferent landscape, its spine a street of thick, unforgiving mud. From the coach stepped Etta Vale, her face pale with cold and fatigue. She clutched 2 items as if they were the last vestiges of a former life, a handsome, but worn, leather sewing box, and a heavy cloth-bound ledger. The ledger was old, its corners softened with use, its pages filled with a precise, elegant script that was now meaningless to anyone but her. A voice, her own, echoed not in the cold air, but in the private chamber of memory. I didn't come to Ash Juniper to fall in love. I came to find a future. Perhaps, but first, I came to reclaim a stolen name. Her gaze swept the street. It was a town of grim functionality, a general store, a smithy, a saloon called the Stag Lantern, from which the tinny sound of a poorly played piano already leaked, though the sun was still high. But her eyes settled on one building, more solid than the others, with paned glass windows that glowed with a sick, jaundiced yellow light in the gray afternoon. The sign, painted in severe black letters, read Horace Lyle Condone. The was an ominous flourish, suggesting unseen partners, a web of interest that spread far beyond this muddy street. The sound of the town was the clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the lowing of cattle in a nearby pen, but beneath it all, another sound persisted, a nervous, metallic heartbeat that seemed to emanate from the small post office, the click-clack of the telegraph key. It was the sound of news, of commerce, of connection, but to Etta, it sounded like the frantic tapping of a secret trying to stay hidden. Tack, tack, tack. A message sent, a fate sealed, a lie given the speed of lightning. The perspective shifted again, soaring high above the town, over the rolling, snow-dusted plains to a high, windswept promontory known as Crow's Ladder Ridge. There, a lone figure on horseback sat silhouetted against a sky bruised with the deep indigo of coming twilight. Rowan Creed. From this vantage point, he could see his entire ranch spread out below the house, the bunkhouse, the corrals, the vast, empty pastures. He wasn't looking at it with pride of ownership. He was taking inventory of his own solitude. The wind whipped at the collar of his coat and tore at the brim of his hat. His face was weathered and stern, a landscape of hard lines and quiet grief. This was a man who had long forgotten the shape of a smile, a man whose laughter, if he ever had any, was now just a faint echo in a house too big and too quiet. The ranch wasn't just his land, it was his penance. The image dissolved, the cold wind of the ridge fading back into the quiet warmth of the bedroom. The present rushed back in, silent and heavy. Etta's hand, small and pale against the dark wool of the blanket, emerged. She reached across the space between them, her fingers hesitating for a moment before coming to rest on his throat, just beside his collar. Her touch was feather-light, tracing the faint, silvery line of a scar that ran from just below his ear to the hollow of his collarbone. It was an old wound, long healed, but her touch seemed to reawaken it. Rowan did not pull away, but a change, subtle as a shift in the wind, came over him. His jaw tightened. A muscle twitched in his cheek. His eyes, fixed on a point on the far wall, darkened as a memory, sharp and brutal, surfaced against his will. He suppressed a flinch, pushing the recollection back down into the locked box where he kept such things. He had not allowed anyone to touch that scar in 15 years. He hadn't allowed anyone close enough to try. Etta felt the tension in him, the sudden, guarded stillness. She did not need to ask. Her fingers lingered for a moment longer, a gesture of silent acknowledgement, before retreating back into the warmth of the blankets. No more words were spoken. None were needed. The air in the room was thick with all the things they had not said, all the questions they had not asked. Tonight was not about the undoing of buttons. It was about the careful, tentative unspooling of trust. It was the first stitch in a tapestry that neither of them could yet see. A silent promise had been made in the flickering lamplight to see the other's wounds and not run. This fragile peace, this shared quiet in a lonely room, was a beginning. But it was the beginning of a long and difficult road, a path that would lead them both through a storm of deceit and danger before they ever found their way to the calm on the other side. The ghosts of Red Butte Basin were not yet done with Rowan Creed, and Etta Vale had brought ghosts of her own. The sharp light of morning was a poor substitute for the forgiving flicker of the oil lamp, the silence that had settled between them in the night, a fragile truce of shared vulnerability, had evaporated with the dawn. Rowan Creed was already gone, the indent of his body on the bed's edge a cool memory. Etta Vale dressed quickly, her fingers moving with purpose, buttoning her own dress, the offer of the night before, and his gentle refusal, had changed the terrain between them. It was no longer a simple arrangement of shelter. It was something complicated, undefined, and dangerous to them both. She found him not in the house, but in the barn, the vast, cold cathedral of his solitude. He was testing the cinch on a saddle, his movements economical and harsh. "Mr. Creed," she said, her voice steady. He didn't look up, just gave a short nod, acknowledging her presence. "I require employment," Etta stated, stepping further into the dusty light. "I am not a cook, and I am not a scullery maid. I am a seamstress, and I am a bookkeeper. I understand you're preparing for the fall cattle drive." This made him pause. He finally turned, his eyes sweeping over her. She was a town woman, fine-boned and pale. He squinted, skeptical. "Seamstress, the canvas on your chuck wagon will need patching before it faces a mountain storm," she said, her gaze moving past him to a pile of gear. "Your saddle rigging is cracked. The harness leather for your pack mules looks stiff as iron. I can mend the canvas, treat and stitch the leather, and ensure your men's gear doesn't fail them in a high pass. I also saw the stack of invoices on your desk. A ranch this size lives or dies by its ledgers, especially its accounts with the general store." Rowan straightened, crossing his arms. The man from the night before was gone, replaced by the master of the Creed Ranch, a man who trusted no one easily. He needed what she offered. The last man he'd hired to check the books had a fondness for the bottle and a heavier hand with the pen, and his gear was in poor shape. "Vesper Dunn," he said, naming the general store. "Their account is a mess. I am meticulous with numbers," Etta said. "And I am meticulous with a needle, room and board, and a fair wage for the season." He considered her, the silence stretching. He saw a woman who looked like she belonged in a parlor, yet spoke of harness leather and ledgers with an unnerving confidence. He didn't like complications, and Etta Vale was the definition of one. But he was also a practical man. "I don't need a seamstress for the season. I need one for the week," he said gruffly. "The books. That might take longer. I pay in cash. Board is included. For now, you'll take the small room off the kitchen. When the work is done, you move on." It was a dismissal, an underlining of the boundary he'd reestablished. "Understood." "Mr. Creed," she replied, her face betraying no emotion. The transaction was set. Her first task was to retrieve the ranch's outstanding accounts from Vesper Dunn in Ash Juniper. Riding one of the ranch's gentler mares, Etta felt the biting wind of the high basin. The town, when she arrived, was a bustle of noise and mud. She tied the mare outside the sprawling false-fronted building that served as the town's commercial heart. The bell above the door jangled, announcing her arrival. The store smelled of coffee beans, cured tobacco, brine from a pickle barrel, and the sharp, metallic scent of new tools. Miss Vale. What a genuine pleasure. Etta turned. Horace Lyle stood by the counter, a man whose expensive suit and cologne seemed an affront to the dusty town. He was handsome in a polished, insincere way, his smile too wide, his eyes too quick. He was the man whose name was painted on the bank window, the man who held the town's debt in his manicured hands. He took her hand, bowing slightly, holding it a fraction of a second too long. "I had heard you were gracing our humble town, but rumor had it you were staying out at the Creed Ranch, a lonely place for a woman of your refinement." Etta gently but firmly retrieved her hand. "I'm here on Mr. Creed's business, Mr. Lyle, to collect his accounts." Of course business," he laughed, as if it were a private joke. He signaled to the clerk, who scurried to a back room. "Rowan Creed is a fortunate man, though, I must say, the company he keeps is surprising. First a recluse, now he has you." His eyes traveled over her, appraisingly. "Mr. Creed is my employer," Etta said, her voice chilled. void of any opening for familiarity. The clerk returned with a thick bundle of receipts and a ledger. Lyle took it, his fingers brushing hers as he passed it over. "Anything you need, Miss Vale. Anything at all. The office of Horace Lyle Company is always open to you. Good day. Mr. Lyle," she said, turning away before he could reply. As she stepped out onto the boardwalk, she passed the Stag Lantern Saloon. The doors swung open, releasing a wave of warm, stale air and the low murmur of men. "That's her." A voice drifted out. "The new one at Creed's. Heard she worked the railroad line." Another voice, low and suspicious, replied, "Worked the telegraph key down in Cheyenne. Woman like that? She knows things. Things folks ain't meant to know. I don't trust it. Don't trust her." Etta kept walking, her back straight. Let them whisper. The fact that they knew her past, that they feared the lightning wire, was a tool, not a hindrance. She was securing the ledgers to her saddle when a wagon rattled to a stop nearby. "Miss," the voice was female, sharp and commanding. Etta looked up. Maud Kerrigan sat commandingly on the wagon seat, holding the reins to a team of fine gray horses. She was a woman in her 50s, with a face weathered like granite, her eyes the color of a winter sky. She owned the ranch on the north shore of the basin, the only other major power in the valley. She was Rowan Creed's chief rival. She did not smile. She simply stared at Etta, a long, assessing look that stripped away all pretense. It was not a look of welcome. It was the look of a queen examining a new, unidentified piece on her chessboard. Etta nodded politely. Maud Kerrigan just held her gaze, then, with a sharp snap of the reins, drove her wagon away, leaving Etta in a cloud of dust. Back at the ranch, Etta established her workspace in a small, cold room that had once been an office. She set to work first on the physical tasks. Her hands, which Rowan had seen as pale and soft, were deft and strong. She used an awl to punch new holes in a cracked leather strap, her movements precise. She restitched the heavy canvas tarp with a sailor's needle and waxed thread, her stitches small and even, stronger than the original. She was, as she had promised, meticulous. When the mending was done, she turned to the ledgers. Rowan's desk was a chaotic mess of receipts, invoices, and tally sheets. Etta organized them, her quill pens scratching quietly in the afternoon light. She built her own ledger, cross-referencing every purchase. For hours, she worked, the only sound the scrape of her pen and the rustle of paper. Then she found it, a discrepancy, small, but repeated. On the invoices from Vesper Dunn, the Creed Ranch was billed for 50-pound bags of mineral salt, essential for the herd, but the delivery manifests, tucked deep in Rowan's pile, showed only 30-pound bags were delivered, a consistent overcharge. She checked back for months. It was there, every time, a slow, steady bleed, signed off by the clerk at the general store, the same store where Horace Lyle seemed so at home. The door creaked open. Rowan stood there, filling the frame. He looked from her to the neatly organized stacks of paper, to the new ledger she was creating. He didn't acknowledge the work. He didn't thank her. He just stood there, his presence a heavy weight, his guard firmly back in place. He looked at the mended harness hanging on a peg. "The work," he said, his voice flat, dry as summer grass. "When it's done, you'll be paid, and you'll move on. This isn't a homestead, Miss Vale." It was a sharp, deliberate pushback, a reminder of their bargain, a denial of the fragile connection they had formed. Etta didn't look up from her numbers. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her sting. "I understand the terms. Mr. Creed, I am simply fulfilling them." He watched her for a moment longer. This strange, quiet woman who mended his canvas and audited his books. He seemed to want to say something more, but instead, he just turned and left, the sound of his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Later that day, a young man rode up to the ranch house on a lathered horse. He was delivering the mail pouch. Etta had come out to the porch for a breath of air. The young man, spotting her, dismounted. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes wide and nervous. He was perhaps 20, but his face was old with worry. "I'm Etta Vale." His face paled, then flushed. I know. I'm Olin Trainer. I run the post office, the telegraph." He looked around, ensuring no one, especially Rowan, was watching. "I remember you," Etta said softly. "You were the delivery boy. You used to bring the wires to the Vale farm, before—" Olin swallowed, his gaze dropping to the worn planks of the porch. "Miss Vale, I shouldn't, but I knew your brother, Jonah. He was good to me. He always tipped me a nickel." He fumbled in his vest pocket, pulling out a tiny, folded slip of paper. He pressed it into her hand. This ain't official. It ain't a wire. Just something I overheard. You be careful. That's all. Just be careful." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat, jumped back on his horse, and rode away as if the devil were on his heels. Etta unfolded the paper. It wasn't in Morse. It was just a few letters, hastily scrawled in pencil: LMK, water rights, Watch the Wire, Lyle, Maud Kerrigan. She folded the paper, her hand trembling slightly, and slipped it deep into her pocket. A piece of the puzzle, an ally, that afternoon. She collected a pile of mending from the bunkhouse. At the bottom was Rowan's heavy canvas duster, the one he wore on the range. It was torn at the elbow, and a seam was pulling loose at the shoulder. As she laid it flat on her table, her fingers brushed against the collar. There, just below the neckline, was a patch of clumsy, thick stitching. It was the reverse side of the scar she had touched last night. She traced the old seam. It was sewn with gut, not thread, and the stitches were wide and desperate. The work of a man in a hurry, a man trying to close a deep, bleeding wound, a knife wound, just as she'd suspected. It was a tangible piece of the violence that had shaped him, the event that had hollowed him out and left that permanent shadow in his eyes. Her own needle and thread felt inadequate. She mended the torn elbow, her stitches neat and strong, but she left the old, rough stitching at the collar alone. It was not her scar to mend. Night fell again, blanketing the ranch in a profound silence. Etta sat in her small room, her own cloth-bound ledger, the one from the stagecoach, open before her. The lamp cast a small, brave light. She was too restless to sleep. Then she heard it, faint and thin against the rising wind, came the sound of a harmonica. It was a simple tune, a mournful melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was pure, unadulterated loneliness, given a voice. She knew, instinctively, it was Rowan. He would be on the dark porch, believing himself to be alone, playing his grief to the empty basin. The music was the sound of the man who had pulled the blanket over her, not the hard-eyed rancher who had spoken to her earlier. Etta listened for a long time, the lonely notes weaving into the fabric of her own resolve. She dipped her pen in the inkwell. She turned to a fresh page in her brother's old ledger. The music continued, a soundtrack to her own quiet vow. She wrote, "Lyle is bleeding the ranch. Kerrigan is his partner. The rumor of my telegraph work makes them nervous." She paused, the harmonica hitting a long, sorrowful note. The key to Jonah's stolen land is not in a ledger. It's in the telegraph archives. The name of the thief, the one who sent the false wire, the one who ruined my brother, is in Lyle's office. The fragile understanding of that first night in the ranch house had been packed away, like fine china too precious for daily use. In its place was the hard, practical reality of survival. The Creed Ranch, Etta quickly learned, was not just a property, it was a fortress under siege, and the attacks were coming from two fronts, one of paper and one of earth. The first offensive, Track A, began as a whisper in the basin. It traveled from the Stag Lantern Saloon to the general store, a rumor seeded with the insidious skill of a farmer planting noxious weeds. The snowpack on the Cinder Mountains was the lowest in a decade, the cold prayer spring. which fed the entire South Basin, was running at a trickle. Rowan Creed was overstocked, his herds too large for the coming drought. It was a lie, and Rowan knew it, but lies, in a land this dependent on futures and credit, traveled faster than truth. Buyers who had been inquiring about his young stock, the steers he needed to sell before winter to pay his own notes, suddenly grew hesitant. The offers that did come in were insulting, predicated on the risk of a dry season. "It's Maud Kerrigan," Rowan said, his voice flat. He was staring out the window at his own pastures, still thick with cured buffalo grass. "She's poisoning the well, trying to force a sell-off." He was talking to himself as much as to Etta, who stood in the doorway of her small office. "She wants you to sell cheap," Etta said, not as a question, but as a statement. "She wants me to sell to her," he corrected, turning. "She wants the water rights to the Cold Prayer. They're tied to my deed. If she can break me, she gets the water, and she controls the whole basin." While Rowan tracked the path of the rumor, Etta was on track B, following a trail of ink. Her meticulous audit of the Vesper Dunn accounts had already exposed the overcharges on mineral salt. But now, digging deeper into the ranch's expenditures, she found new anomalies, a pattern of waste that didn't fit with Rowan's tight-fisted management. There were invoices for kerosene, far more than the ranch's lamps required. There were receipts for expensive, pre-formed horseshoe nails, a luxury when Rowan's own blacksmith forged his own. These invoices weren't from Vesper Dunn. They were from a hardware supplier 2 counties over, a company she had never heard of, but the payment authorizations, tucked neatly behind the receipts, bore the elegant, familiar signature of Horace Lyle. Why, she wondered, was the president of the Ash Juniper Bank countersigning invoices for kerosene and nails? It was an answer that tightened her chest. Lyle wasn't just a banker. He was a quartermaster. He wasn't just managing Rowan's debt. He was actively, secretly supplying someone who was undermining the ranch from within. The 2 tracks ran parallel, 2 snakes moving through the same grass, and a few days later, Rowan rode straight into the first one. He'd gone to check the headwaters of the Cold Prayer Spring himself, needing to see with his own eyes that the water still flowed, strong and clear. It did, gushing from the rock with the same generous, icy pulse it had for 1,000 years. Maud Kerrigan was there, watering her team of fine gray horses, as if she had been waiting for him. She sat on her wagon, a queen surveying her domain, and gave him a thin smile. "Checking your supply." "Rowan," she called out, her voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "It looks a little low this season, doesn't it?" Rowan dismounted, walking to the edge of the pool. He dipped his hand in the frigid water. "Looks the same as it has for 20 years. Maud, clear and deep. Is it?" She clucked to her horses, turning them. "Funny how things can look deep one day and be dry as a bone the next. Things change. The land shifts. Sometimes. Water rights get reassessed. You know," she paused, letting the words hang in the air. "A man with too much land and not enough water finds himself in a tight spot. He might have to sell off his assets, just to stay afloat. It's the law of the land. Rowan, only the strong survive. And a woman who spreads lies to choke her neighbors might find herself choking on them," Rowan said, his voice low and dangerous. Maud Kerrigan laughed, a dry, humorless sound, just neighborly concern. "Mr. Creed, you have a good day." She snapped the reins, her wagon pulling away, leaving Rowan alone with the sound of the perfectly healthy spring and the very real threat of her ambition. That same afternoon, the word reassessed echoed in Etta's mind. It was a banker's word. It was the word that had broken her family. The vague unease that had driven her to Ash Juniper now crystallized into a cold, sharp memory. She saw her brother, Jonah, standing on the porch of their small farmhouse, his face pale with disbelief. He was a good man, a trusting man, not a meticulous bookkeeper. He was holding a piece of paper. "A notice of default. It ain't due. I tell you," Jonah's voice, raw with panic. The note's not due till the 1st of August. I got the money coming from the Army contract, and the banker not Lyle, but his predecessor, a man with the same dead eyes, had calmly produced a folded slip of paper, a telegraph message, the wire we received. Mr. Vale, confirmed your agreement to a new due date of June 1st. That was yesterday. As you are in default, the bank must take possession of the collateral, which is the land. I never sent that wire. I never agreed to that. That's not my signature. But it had not mattered. The wire was official. The land was lost. Jonah, broken and defeated, had left for the silver mines in Nevada. And Etta had never seen him again. It wasn't a rumor that had ruined her brother. It was a lie, sent by lightning. Her hands shook. Kerosene, water rights, forged wires. It was the same plan. She rode into town, tying her mare not outside the bank, but outside the post office. Olin Traynor was behind the counter, nervously sorting mail. When he saw her, his face went pale. "Miss Vale," he stammered, looking at the door. "Olin," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I need your help, not as a postmaster, but as a friend of Jonah Vale. I can't get involved. Mr. Lyle, he watches everything. I don't need new wires. I need the old ones, the archives." Olin looked physically ill. That's against federal regulations. I could lose my post. I could go to jail. Miss Vale, they are using the same trick on Rowan Creed that they used on my brother. They ruined him. Olin, they stole his land with a piece of paper from this very office. You know it. I know it. Jonah was good to you. He always said you were a smart boy. He was torn, his gaze darting from her to the dusty back room where the archives were kept. Finally, with a trembling hand, he unlatched the door. 5 minutes. If anyone comes in, I'll whistle Yankee Doodle. If you hear it, you were never here. She slipped into the small, dark room. It smelled of dust and old paper. Spindles of telegraph tape and onion skin copybooks were crammed onto shelves, a library of the town's secrets. She ran her fingers along the faded labels, her heart pounding. 3 years ago, June. She found the copybook. She flipped through the brittle pages, her fingers smudged with dry ink, and there it was, the original wire sent to Jonah, confirming the new due date, and beneath it, the flimsy carbon of the reply from him, agreeing to the terms. It was signed, J. Vale. Etta stared at it. She knew her brother's signature as well as her own. Jonah's hand was sharp, impatient, hurried. This was a careful, almost artistic drawing of a signature. The J was too ornate. The V had a long, looping tail, a flourish Jonah never would have used. It was a forgery, a clumsy one, but official. A cold, vindicating fury settled over her, steadying her shaking hands. She had it. She had the method. She closed the book, her mind racing. Who had access to the wire? Who could have sent it as she stepped back into the main office? Olin was nervously wiping the counter. She gave him a short, grateful nod and walked out. Her purpose now a steel rod in her spine. She was so focused. She almost didn't notice the new element that had arrived in ash juniper. As she passed the swinging doors of the Stag Lantern, she glanced inside. A man stood at the bar, and he did not belong. He was not a dusty ranch hand or a mud-caked farmer. He was clean, his clothes well-made, and he wore a light brown, flat-brimmed hat. His gun belt was new, the holsters tied low and snug against his thighs. He was talking to the bartender, Cyrus, his voice too low to hear, but his posture was easy, confident, and predatory. Just as Etta paused, Rowan Creed pushed through the doors. He was looking for one of his hands, but he stopped dead when he saw the man at the bar. The low hum of the saloon died instantly. The man in the brown hat turned, a slow reptilian smile spreading across his face. "Well now, must be Rowan Creed. You're new," Rowan stated. His voice was dead calm, emptied of all emotion. "Pike hollerin', just passing through," the man said, not offering a hand, curious about the local landscape. Heard you were planning a cattle drive. A man like me is always looking for short-term work. Guarding a herd. Perhaps. We're not hiring, Rowan said. Oh, I heard you were. Pike smiled. Heard you were having difficulties. Water rumors. Buyers pulling out. Sounds like a man who could use a fast gun. He tapped the brim of his hat. Just asking about your schedule. Which pass you favor. How many men you run with. Rowan took one step closer. He did not look at Pike's guns. He looked at his eyes. We don't have much trouble here. Hollerin', and we don't like men who ask too many questions. The next stagecoach leaves at dawn. I suggest you be on it. The smile on Pike's face thinned. That a threat? Mr. Creed. It's a weather forecast, Rowan replied, his voice still terrifyingly quiet. A storm's coming in. It's best not to be caught on the wrong side of the pass when it hits. Etta, watching from the street, saw the shift in Rowan. This was not the lonely rancher who played the harmonica. This was not the wary employer. His hand didn't move toward his gun. It just rested, relaxed, on his thigh. It was the lethal calm of a man who had faced this exact scenario before and had never lost. She realized, in that instant, what he had been: a marshal, a tracker, something hard and unforgiving, forged in a fire she couldn't yet imagine. Pike Halloran held his gaze for a long 10 seconds. He was sizing Rowan up, and he clearly didn't like the measurement. He gave a short, sharp nod. Forecast taken, he said. He tossed a coin on the bar, turned, and walked out, pushing past Etta without a glance. He hadn't been defeated. Etta knew. He had just been delayed. That night, the tension on the ranch was a palpable thing. Etta sat in her office, the memory of the forged wire burning in her mind. Pike Halloran, the kerosene invoices, the water rumor, all the pieces were clicking into place. She blew out her lamp, but the darkness was wrong. The air was tainted. She smelled it, the sharp, acrid scent of kerosene, far stronger than the trace of her extinguished wick. It was coming from outside. Her heart hammered. She grabbed her unlit lamp and moved quickly, silently, out the kitchen door and toward the feed storage shed. The smell was overwhelming. She pushed the door open. In the darkness, she could see a faint glow. A single lamp was sitting on the floor in the far corner. Its wick turned dangerously low. Sputtering, a dark, wet trail glistened on the floorboards, snaking from the lamp to a large pile of winter feed sacks. It was a fuse, crude but effective. In another minute, the low flame would touch the trail of oil, and Rowan Creed's entire winter feed supply his ability to survive until spring would vanish in a pillar of fire. She didn't panic. She moved with cold precision. She crossed the shed in 3 strides, raised the lamp's chimney, and pinched the hot, sputtering wick between her thumb and forefinger, ignoring the searing pain. Darkness. She stood breathing heavily in the pitch black, the smell of kerosene burning her lungs, the adrenaline singing in her veins. She had stopped it, just barely. Her eyes adjusted to the faint starlight coming through the open door. She looked at the pile of feed, and behind it, shoved into a dark corner, was a large, empty burlap sack. It wasn't one of theirs. Theirs were stamped Creed Ranch. This one was stenciled with 2 bold letters, KBN, Kerrigan, Bank. She grabbed the sack and marched back to the main house. Rowan was at the big table, wiping down his rifle, the lamplight glinting off the oiled steel. He looked up as she entered. She threw the burlap sack onto the table. It landed with a soft thump next to his cleaning rags. "Someone tried to burn your feed store," she said, her voice shaking with repressed fury. "I stopped it." Rowan went utterly still. He looked from her face, pale in the lamplight, to the sack. He read the letters, KBN. A muscle in his jaw clenched. Kerrigan and Lyle, Etta said, pressing her burned fingers to her skirt. "I checked your invoices. You're being billed for kerosene you're not using, and horseshoe nails you don't buy. All of it countersigned by Horace Lyle. He's supplying the sabotage." Rowan stood slowly, his eyes dark. "So, it's not just rumors, it's fire. You have a traitor on your ranch." Rowan, Etta said, meeting his gaze. Someone who had access to that shed. Someone who lit that lamp. He looked at her, his gaze sharp and assessing. Or we have a banker in the town, he replied, his voice hard as iron. They're one and the same. Someone on my payroll is working for him. Etta took a deep breath. This was the moment. This is how they do it. This is their plan. They squeeze you with rumors. They burn what they can't scare you out of. And if that fails, they use the telegraph. He saw the raw, personal pain in her face. Jonah Vale, he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, her eyes flashing, the last of her caution burning away. I found the forged wire this afternoon, in the archives, the one they used to steal his land. Lyle and Kerrigan are working together. They are using the exact same plan they used on my brother. They think I'm just a seamstress mending canvas. They don't know I can read their playbook. They don't know I know exactly what they're doing. A new respect passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the new, dangerous ground they stood on. The barriers were down again, but this time it was not vulnerability. It was a shared, cold purpose. They're coming for the herd, Rowan said. Maud threatened my water rights. Pike Holleran is in town, asking about my schedule. That's the muscle. And Lyle is the mind. Etta finished. He holds the false paper. He controls the wire. Rowan picked up his rifle, testing the action. It made a smooth, deadly click-clack in the quiet room. We'll have to take two paths. Then, he said, finally looking at her as a true partner, I'll protect this herd. I'll draw Holleran and Kerrigan's men out. I'll handle the fire. Etta straightened, her burned fingers curling into a fist. And I'll handle the paper, she said, her voice as cold as the spring water. I'm going back to that telegraph office. I'm not just going to find the forged wire. I'm going to find the proof of who sent it. The truce was a 3-day-old memory. The ranch had moved from a state of wary vigilance to one of high alert. Rowan Creed, anticipating a move against his herd, had pushed his men to their limit, riding the perimeter of his grazing lands from false dawn until well past twilight. He'd ordered the main herd, the vulnerable young steers he needed for the fall sale, moved to the broad, gray-grass meadow bordering the southern edge of his property. It was open range, easy to watch, but it had one fatal flaw. Its entire western edge crumbled into the Dry Lantern Ravine. A deep, jagged scar on the earth, a natural boundary that had now become a liability. Etta had insisted on riding with them. She was on a steady buckskin mare named Maple. Her ledger work temporarily abandoned, she had argued, with a logic Rowan couldn't fault, that the trader on his ranch was still unknown. She would not stay in the house, a potential target, and she would not be left behind. She rode as a lookout, her sewing box replaced by a canteen and a small roll of bandages from the house, a practical addition that made Rowan's foreman, a grizzled man named Silas, nod in grim approval. The attack came not with a shout, but with a sound. A south wind had been tormenting them all morning, a spiteful, unseen herder pushing relentlessly from the south, making the cattle restless and irritable. They were already drifting toward the ravine, their heads low against the stinging dust. Rowan and his men, including the young hand Luke, were riding hard to push them back, their faces covered with bandanas. Then came the sound that did not belong. Clang, clang, clang. It was the frantic, panicked ringing of a heavy cattle bell. Not the rhythmic toll of a led steer, but a sound of pure terror, struck over and over. It came from the west, near the line camp at the ravine's edge. The herd, already on edge from the wind, broke. The shift was instantaneous. The lowing of nervous cattle became a single, percussive roar. The ground itself began to tremble as over 1,000 head of beef turned as one, a solid, thundering wall of terror, and ran with the wind, directly toward the jagged lip of the Dry Lantern Ravine. Stampede Rowan's voice was ripped from his throat by the wind. They're pushing them over Luke. Silas, ride the flank. Turn them now. The air filled with red dust, a choking, impenetrable cloud that blotted out the sun. It was chaos, a nightmare of bellowing, thundering hooves, and the sharp, terrified whistles of the cowhands. Rowan gave his horse its head, launching it down the treacherous slope that ran parallel to the herd's path. He was no longer a rancher. He was a force of nature, his face a mask of cold, concentrated fury. He saw it all in a fraction of a second. The lead steer, a powerful animal, running blind with terror, was less than 100 yards from the drop. If the leader went over, the entire herd would follow, a cascade of broken bodies and financial ruin. His horse, a muscular roan trained for this exact moment, plunged through loose scree and rabbit brush, its lungs burning. Rowan was already undoing his lariat, his eyes locked on the horns of the lead steer. He was riding into the path of the stampede, a suicidal maneuver, betting his life on a single throw. The ravine loomed, a gaping mouth of shadow and rock. Now he bellowed to his horse. The roan planted its feet. Rowan stood in the stirrups, his arm a blur. The rope sang out, a perfect wide loop that shot through the dust-choked air and settled cleanly over the steer's wide horns. The moment the rope went taut, Rowan's horse dug in, leaning back on its haunches, muscles straining against the impossible weight. The steer, its neck snapped sideways by the sudden force, bellowed in rage and confusion. It stumbled, its front legs buckling, and was turned, hauled agonizingly, yard by yard, away from the precipice. It was a pivot of immense, terrifying force. The steer behind it, seeing its leader turn, also veered, and the one behind that, the entire wave of panicked cattle, following the blind instinct of the herd, began to shear away from the ravine. A massive, thundering river diverted just feet from the waterfall. Etta had not followed Rowan. She was not a roper. She was an investigator. When the bell rang, her head had snapped toward the line camp. She spurred Maple, riding hard against the grain, away from the stampede and toward the source of the sound. She burst through the wall of red dust and found the small, empty dugout that served as the line camp. The bell itself was gone, taken by the saboteur, but she saw what she was looking for. The camp was built against a fence line. The barbed wire, strung taut that morning, was not broken, it was cut. 3 clean, parallel cuts. The wire curled back like dead vines. This was where the attacker had broken in, driven a horse into the herd's flank, and begun the ringing. As she scanned the ground, she saw the hoofprints, deep and deliberate, coming from the direction of Maud Kerrigan's northern range. A rifle crack split the air. It was not a sound from the stampede. It was sharp, high velocity, and close. A puff of dust exploded from a rock not 10 feet from Maple's head. The mare screamed and reared. Etta wrestled for control, her eyes flying to the ridge above the ravine. A figure sat on horseback, silhouetted against the gray sky. He was too far to see clearly, but the flat, light brown hat was unmistakable. Pike Halloran. He had been waiting, watching, intending to be a spectator to Rowan's destruction. He raised his rifle, not at her, but in the air. A warning shot, a message, leave, this is not your business. He had not counted on Rowan Creed. From the dust cloud below, a second shot answered the first. This one was different. It was the heavy, booming report of a buffalo rifle, and it was not a warning. Rowan, having turned the herd, had seen the shot aimed at Etta. A new cold fury had eclipsed the adrenaline of the stampede. He had pulled his own rifle from its saddle scabbard, taken aim in a fraction of a second, and fired. Pike Halloran's light brown hat flew from his head, spinning through the air like a clay pigeon. For a long second, the gunman sat frozen, his head bare. He had been outskilled, outshot, and humiliated, all in one impossible, long-distance shot. He touched the top of his head, as if to be sure it was still there. Then, wheeling his horse around, he vanished over the ridge. Rowan's weather forecast had been delivered. The immediate danger was over. But the air was still thick with the choking red dust, the metallic tang of fear, and the smell of sweat-soaked animals. The herd had slowed, milling in confusion, their sides heaving. Etta rode Maple down the slope, her own heart hammering. She found the cowhands regrouping. Silas was shouting orders, but one man was missing. Luke Silas roared. "Where's Luke?" Etta saw him. He was on the ground, his horse standing over him, trembling. The young hand was trying to sit up, his face pale beneath a mask of red grime. His leg was trapped beneath his fallen mount. "He's pinned," Etta yelled, sliding from Maple. She and Silas rushed over, pushing the horse off the young man. Luke groaned, his teeth gritted. "It's my leg. I think it's broke." It wasn't broken, but it was bad. A long, wicked gash ran down his calf where he'd been struck by a rock or a passing hoof. Blood pulsed from the wound, staining the red dust a darker, muddy crimson. He was in danger of being trampled by the still milling cattle. Etta didn't hesitate. She knelt in the dirt, unmindful of the blood. She pulled the roll of bandages from her saddlebag. Her hands, the bookkeeper's hands, were steady. She ripped open Luke's denim trousers, exposing the wound. "It's deep. Silas. Pressure. Right here." She worked quickly, her voice calm and authoritative, cleaning the wound as best she could with water from her canteen, then applying a thick, tight field dressing. She wrapped the bandages with a practiced efficiency that made the grizzled foreman stare. She cinched the knot, her hands covered in the young man's blood. "It'll hold until we get him to the house," she said, sitting back on her heels. Luke looked at her, his eyes wide with pain and a new, profound gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. I thought... You're all right." "Luke," Etta said softly. As Silas and another hand lifted Luke onto a horse, Etta stood, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. She walked to retrieve her canteen, which had rolled near the edge of the chaotic, trampled ground. Her boot hit something small and hard. She bent down. It wasn't a rock. It was a small, dark square, slick with oilcloth to make it waterproof. A packet of matches. It must have fallen from the saboteur's pocket during the chaotic ride. She picked it up. It was heavy, full, and embossed on the front, in elegant gold lettering that was impossible to mistake, were two words: Horace Lyle. Etta's blood went cold. She closed her fist around the small packet. The world, which had been a blur of dust and panic, snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. Water, cattle, bank, it was all one chessboard. Maud Kerrigan spread the rumors of drought, driving down the price of the herd. Pike Holleran, their hired gun, tried to destroy the herd physically, and Horace Lyle, the respectable banker, supplied the matches for the arson, supplied the wire for the forgeries, and, she now realized, paid the men who cut the fences. They were not separate enemies. They were a single, three-headed monster. Rowan rode up, his roan caked in sweat and dust. He dismounted, his rifle still in his hand. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes etched deep. He looked at Luke, who was now mounted and swaying, then at Etta, at her hands, dark with Luke's blood. His voice was a low rasp. "You handled yourself." "Miss Vale." She met his gaze. The matchbox was a hard, cold secret in her palm. "Luke will be fine. The wound is clean." Rowan nodded, his gaze lingering on her. The hardness, the raw fury he'd shown Pike Holleran, was gone. In its place was something else, something softer, something that looked almost like pain. "You don't owe me a thing," he said, his voice quiet, meant only for her. "You don't owe this ranch, and you don't owe me. But you saved my herd, and you saved my man." He had called Luke, "my man." He had called the herd, "my herd." But his eyes were on her, and the gratitude in them was a raw, unguarded thing. It was the look of a man who had been alone for so long. He had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside him in a fight. They stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping at their clothes, the bellowing of the scattered herd the only sound. It was a look that lasted longer than was proper, a silent acknowledgement of the bullets dodged, the lives saved, and the shared enemy that was now, finally, in focus. Rowan was the first to look away. He turned back to his horse, his public mask of the hard-bitten rancher sliding back into place. "Silas," he barked, "let's get this herd moved back to the north pasture. The show's over." They all turned back to the hard, thankless work. The new rumor began to spread 2 days later. When Etta went into Ash Juniper for supplies, the atmosphere in Vesper Dun was different. Trina Moss, the proprietor, was civil, but her eyes were cold. The men who had once tipped their hats now just stared. She heard it from 2 women by the pickle barrel, their voices a stage whisper designed to be overheard. "That's her, the one Creed hired, the bookkeeper. Heard she used to be a telegraph girl. Fancy. Well, I also heard that the day she rode out with them, his entire herd stampeded, right toward the ravine. They say he nearly lost 'em all." The other woman gasped, putting a hand to her chest. "Mercy, you don't suppose she had something to do with it?" "Well, it's just strange, isn't it? Creed's been running cattle in that basin for 20 years, never had a stampede like that. Then he hires a woman from out of town, a woman who knows the telegraph wires, and his whole world nearly goes over a cliff. It's bad luck, I tell you, or it's something worse." Etta paid for her supplies, her back straight, her face a mask. They had failed to destroy Rowan's herd. Now, they were starting on her. The wooden church in Ash Juniper was not built for comfort. It was built for necessity, a single, unadorned room of raw pine that smelled of dry dust, brittle hymnal pages, and the faint, lingering scent of lye soap. It was a Tuesday, not a Sunday, but the pews were full. After the stampede, the near disaster at the Creed Ranch, and the whispers of arson, the town council, which consisted of Maud Kerrigan, Horace Lyle, and the proprietor of the general store, had called a public meeting to discuss community security. It was a trap, and both Rowan and Etta knew it. They sat in the third pew, a conspicuous island of isolation. The townsfolk, who had once nodded to Rowan with respect, now offered only nervous, sidelong glances. They were a herd, spooked by rumor, and Maud Kerrigan was the one ringing the bell. Maud stood at the front, next to the unadorned pulpit, dressed in severe black. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words were weighted with the quiet authority of land and money. "We are a community," she began, her gaze sweeping the room. "Built on trust and sound business practices. We all depend on the stability of this basin. When that stability is threatened, we must ask ourselves, why? What has changed?" Her eyes settled on Rowan Creed. "We have all weathered hard seasons, Rowan, but we have always done so with integrity. Lately, however, the troubles on your land have begun to spill over, a stampede that nearly breached the town road, rumors of fire. It suggests a lack of sound management, a volatility." She then turned her gaze, cold and precise, onto Etta. "Perhaps it is the introduction of new elements, outside influences who do not understand our ways. We are, after all, a town of ethics, and our business must be conducted ethically." The implication was clear. Poisoning the air, Rowan Creed, the recluse, had brought in a strange woman, and with her, she had brought chaos. She was the one behind the bad luck. Rowan's hands, resting on his knees, clenched into fists, he made to stand, but Etta's hand, resting lightly on his forearm, stopped him. Before he could speak, Horace Lyle stepped forward, his suit immaculate, his face a mask of civic concern. He held up a hand, as if to calm the room. "Mrs. Kerrigan is right to be concerned with stability," he said, his voice smooth and reasonable. "The financial health of Ash Juniper depends on it. The bank, as you all know, is a neutral party in all this. We are simply stewards of the law." He smiled, a polished, reassuring gesture. "We hold the notes, we manage the accounts, we provide the capital for growth, but we cannot do so in an unstable environment. We must, all of us, Abide by the letter of the law. The bank merely holds us to it. It is our only protection. He was the voice of pure, cold, impartial reason. He was the rock upon which the town was built. It was then that Etta Vale stood. The room, which had been murmuring in agreement with Lyle, went silent. She was a small figure, her dress simple, her hands clasped in front of her. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was perfectly clear, cutting through the dusty air. "Mr. Lyle," she said, her gaze steady. "You speak eloquently of the law." Lyle's smile tightened. "I try. Miss Vale, then perhaps you can clarify a fine point of banking law for us," she continued, her tone one of polite inquiry, a technical question. "For my own edification as a bookkeeper, does the law you so carefully steward, does it permit a bank, or its telegraph operator, to alter the date on a telegraph message concerning a debt dead silence?" The question was so specific, so technical, it hung in the air like a dropped blade. It was not an accusation of arson. It was not a defense against rumor. It was a surgical strike, aimed directly at the heart of Lyle's stewardship. Rowan, beside her, slowly unclenched his fists. He turned his head to look at her, a new, sharp admiration in his eyes. The murmuring that started now was not one of agreement. It was one of confusion and dawning suspicion. Men who had their own notes with the bank, who had received their own telegraphs, shifted in their pews. Horace Lyle, for the first time, lost his composure. A flush crept up his starched collar, but he recovered quickly, letting out a short, condescending laugh. "Miss Vale, that is a truly absurd and fantastical question," he scoffed. "You are a seamstress, are you not? We are discussing matters of grazing rights and public safety, not the imaginary plots of a dime novel. Perhaps you should stick to your ledgers and leave the law to men who understand it." He turned dismissively back to the room. Now, as to the grazing leases on the North Range, he had changed the subject, but the question remained, unanswered, seeding itself in the minds of the townsfolk. The trap had been sprung, but the bait had been poisoned. As the meeting dissolved, the crowd parted around Rowan and Etta, leaving them in a wider circle of isolation than before. Maud's attack had worked. Etta's counterattack had only made them seem more dangerous. They were walking toward the door when a figure brushed past Etta. It was Trina Moss, the owner of the Stag Lantern, a woman with weary eyes who had seen everything in Ash Juniper. She didn't stop, but she leaned in, her voice a low, husky whisper that smelled faintly of whiskey and wood smoke. "He's too clever for one book. Girlie," she breathed, her lips barely moving. "My late husband, Albert, used to handle his freight. Lyle keeps a second ledger, a private one, for his special accounts. Don't look on the shelf. Look under the floor." Etta didn't react, didn't even turn her head. She just kept walking. But the information was a hot coal in her hand. A second ledger, the real one. The ride back to the ranch was silent, the sky a heavy, bruised purple that threatened rain. When they arrived, the first fat drops began to fall. Etta went to her small office, but Rowan followed her. He closed the door, his face grim. "That was a mistake. Etta, was it?" she asked, turning from the desk. "That question. It was too much, too soon. You put a target on your back. You showed your hand." He was angry, but she could see the fear beneath it. "This is what they do. They isolate you, then they move in. You heard that gossip. You saw Holleran. They tried to burn my feed. What do you think they will do to you?" He grabbed his hat from his head and threw it onto the desk. "I want you on the morning stagecoach. I'll pay you for the full season. You take it, and you go. Go to Cheyenne. Go anywhere. This is not your fight." The rain, which had been a sprinkle, suddenly intensified, drumming against the roof and the single window, encasing them in a world of rhythmic, pounding sound. Etta looked at him, her own anger rising, cold and steady. "You think that was a fantastical question? You think I read that in a dime novel?" She stepped closer, her voice low. "That is how they ruined my brother. That is the trick. A forged wire, a changed date. and a man's entire life is stolen by the letter of the law. I have been running from that moment for 3 years. I am not running anymore. I lost Jonah. I will not lose his good name. I will not back down. I am not asking you to back down. Rowan's voice rose, a rough, pained sound that was barely audible over the roar of the rain on the roof. They were in the main room now, the argument having carried them from the office. He paced to the cold fireplace and back. I am asking you to live. You are a bookkeeper. You are a seamstress. You are not a gunman. You are not a spy. I saw Pike Holloran's eyes. He is a man who enjoys his work. I will not have your death on my conscience. The argument had moved, as it always did, to the stable, the only place where a raised voice could be swallowed by the storm. They stood in the central aisle, the air warm with the scent of hay, wet leather, and animals. The rain hammered on the tin roof, a violent, percussive sound. You don't get to make that choice for me, Rowan Etta cried, her hands clenched. You don't get to protect me by sending me away. That isn't protection. That's just another way of letting them win. I am the only one who knows their method. I am the only one who can stop them. Rowan stopped pacing. He stood in the lantern light, his face a landscape of shadows, his shoulders slumped. The rain on the roof was a deafening drum, isolating them, forcing a confession. You don't understand, he said, his voice dropping, all the anger gone, replaced by a profound weariness. You don't know what you are truly asking. You don't know what happens when you stand up to men like that. He lifted a hand, his fingers tracing the faint, silvery scar on his neck, the scar she had touched that first night. I wasn't always a rancher, he said, his voice hollow, barely more than a whisper beneath the storm. I used to be a U.S. Marshal, down in the Kansas territories. I was different then. I believed in the badge. I believed in the law. Just like you said. He stared at a saddle hanging on the wall, but his eyes were 1,000 miles and a decade away. I uncovered a procurement ring, high-ranking army officers, a freight company president, and a land agent. They were selling rotted food to the cavalry, taking bribes, stealing land from the tribes. It was a whole empire built on paper and rot. I gathered the evidence. I wrote the report. I had letters. I had ledgers. I was going to testify in Leavenworth. He paused, swallowing, the memory raw and sharp. I had a partner, Elias. He was a good man, taught me everything. He told me to be careful, that I was kicking a hornet's nest. We were escorting a payroll wagon, or so I thought. It was a setup, an ambush in a dry creek bed. They weren't after the money. Etta, they were after the report. They were after me. His gaze met hers, and she saw the ghost of the man he had been. Elias. He took 3 bullets. He died in my arms, trying to get me to the horses. This, he touched the scar again, was a parting gift from the freight president's top man. He left me for dead, but I lived. Elias didn't. And the report? It vanished. The men I was investigating got promotions. I lost my badge. I lost my partner. And I lost my faith. I came here, to this basin, because I believed I was done with it all. I came here to be left alone. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, warning plea. I will not watch that happen again. I will not watch them cut you down just because you were right. I can't. The stable was silent save for the rain. Etta absorbed his story, the weight of the man named Elias, the true source of Rowan's solitude. He wasn't just a recluse. He was a survivor, a man in hiding from his own conscience. She did not back away. She did not offer pity. She stepped forward, into the circle of lantern light, until she was standing directly in front of him. Slowly, she lifted her hand, her fingers, warm and steady, touched his throat, tracing the same scar. His skin was cold. You're wrong, she said softly. You didn't lose. You were wounded. They took Elias from you. They took Jonah from me. We've both had our names, our futures, our faith, stolen by men who hide behind ledgers and use hired guns to do their dirty work. She held his gaze, her own resolve forged in the fire of his confession. "We are not beaten. Rowan, we are just unfinished. We've both had things taken from us. So let's take them back, together." Rowan looked at her, at the absolute certainty in her eyes. She was not the idealistic fool he had been. She was not the trusting partner he had lost. She was something new. She was a fighter. The marshal in his eyes, long dormant, flickered back to life. "Trina Moss spoke to me," Etta said, her voice dropping to a practical, conspiratorial tone. "As we were leaving, she said Lyle keeps a second ledger. A private one. She said to look under the floor." Rowan's focus sharpened instantly. A double entry. Of course, the real one, where he'd log the payments to Pike, the bribes from Maud, the kerosene. "I have to get it," Etta said, "and I need to get back into that telegraph office. I need the payment wires and the forged signature." "You can't just walk in," Rowan said, his mind already working, the strategist taking over. "The bank is locked. The office is watched. I know how to open a simple tumbler lock," Etta said simply. "My father was a locksmith before he was a farmer, but I need time. I need Lyle, and Maud, and anyone loyal to them, to be looking the other way." Rowan nodded, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips for the first time. "Tomorrow night, I'll send a message to Maud Kerrigan. I'll request an emergency meeting, at her ranch. I'll tell her I'm ready to negotiate the sale of my water rights. She's arrogant. She'll believe she's finally broken me. She'll take the meeting, and Lyle Maud doesn't go to the privy without her banker. He'll be there, to draw up the papers. I will keep them on the North Shore, arguing over every clause, for at least 2 hours. That's your window." The pact was sealed. The air between them, heavy with confessions and the roar of the storm, was now charged with a new, shared purpose. The tension broke, leaving a quiet intimacy in its wake. Rowan looked at her, then at the rain-lashed doorway of the stable. "Etta," he said, his voice rough. "When you go, be careful. I've gotten used to having you here. I won't stand the thought of anything happening to, he gestured vaguely, at the stall, at the hay, at her, to home, the word, spoken by accident, hung in the warm, rain-filled air. He froze. A dark, embarrassed flush crept up his neck. He turned away abruptly, grabbing a currycomb and attacking the flank of his roan, angry at the slip, at the naked vulnerability of the word. "I mean the ranch." He corrected himself, his voice muffled, not looking at her. "The house. This place." Etta watched his back, his shoulders rigid. The sound of the rain on the roof was softer now. A steady drumming, a small, private smile touched her lips, a smile of pure understanding. She let the silence hold for a moment, letting his mistake settle. "I will be careful." "Rowan," she said softly. He didn't turn around, but the frantic brushing stopped. He just nodded. Once. "For the ranch," she added. The night descended on Ash Juniper not with a blanket, but with a shroud. The promised snow had begun to fall, not in soft, gentle flakes, but as a fine, persistent powder, like ash from a distant, celestial fire. It clung to rooftops and boardwalks, muffling the town's few remaining sounds and painting the world in shades of gray and black. It was a conspirator's night, a night for secrets. Etta Vale moved through this silent world like a shadow. She wore a simple, dark wool coat, its collar turned up against the biting cold. Her hair was pinned tightly, but one specific pin was missing. It rested in the palm of her glove, a long, slender piece of steel, its tip honed to a fine point on the ranch's whetstone. It was a tool her father had shown her how to use, a simple instrument for a simple lock, a piece of her past now being repurposed for her future. The alley behind Horace Lyle's bank was a narrow, dark canyon between two false-fronted buildings. The snow was thicker here, undisturbed. At the far end, where the alley met the main street, a figure stood in the deeper shadow of an overhang. Olin Traynor. He was a small, tense knot of fear. His hands shoved deep in his pockets, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He had protested, his voice a terrified whisper when Etta had outlined the plan, but his loyalty to Jonah's memory had won out over his fear of Horace Lyle. The signal was simple, a low, two-note whistle, the call of a nightjar. If he saw anyone approaching, Etta gave him a short, sharp nod, a gesture of thanks he likely didn't see in the gloom. Then she turned to the bank. A single window, tall and narrow, marked Lyle's private office. As Rowan had predicted, Lyle, in his haste to join Maud Kerrigan and gloat over his impending victory, had been careless. The window was not locked. It was merely pushed down tight, leaving a tiny gap at the top. She used the blade of a small knife to pry it upwards, the sound of the wood frame groaning against the sash seeming as loud as a gunshot in the silent alley. She froze, listening. Nothing, only the faint, almost imperceptible hiss of the falling snow. She pushed it up just far enough to squeeze through, her movements fluid and silent, and dropped into the suffocating darkness of the office. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, expensive leather, and something else, the metallic, cloying scent of greed. The air was unnaturally still, the silence profound, and then she heard it. Tick, tock, tick, tock. A tall grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its brass pendulum a hypnotic, gleaming scythe swinging in the faint light filtering through the window. It was the only living thing in the room, its steady, remorseless beat a countdown, each second a grain of sand falling through the hourglass of her opportunity. She did not light a lamp. She had memorized the layout of the room during her single, brief visit. The large oak desk dominated the space. To its right was a bookshelf filled with leather-bound legal texts. Behind it, the heavy iron door of the safe. She moved to the desk first, her gloved fingers gliding over its polished surface. The drawers were locked. She pulled the steel hairpin from her glove. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Feel the pins, Etta. Don't force them. Just persuade them." She inserted the tip into the first lock, her touch delicate. The metal was cold against her fingertips. She probed, twisted, felt the faint click of the first pin giving way. The clock ticked. She felt the second pin. It was stubborn. Tick, tock. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic counter-rhythm to the clock's steady beat. The pin gave. The drawer slid open with a soft, well-oiled whisper. It contained what she expected: stationery, pens, a blotter, public business. She closed it and moved to the next. It too opened easily. It held loan applications, deeds, property assessments, Ledger A, the public face of the bank. She knelt, her gaze sweeping the floor beneath the desk, her fingers searching for the anomaly Trina Moss had hinted at. There, near the wall, one of the pine floorboards was a fraction of an inch shorter than the others, its nailhead slightly less rusted. She used the tip of her knife, wedging it into the seam and prying. The board came up with a low groan of protest. Beneath it, in a shallow, dust-lined hollow, lay another book. This one was not handsome or leather-bound. It was a simple, utilitarian ledger, its cover made of cheap, gray pressboard. Etta lifted it out. Ledger B. She carried it to the window, angling its pages to catch the faint, snowy light from the street. Her breath caught in her throat. This was not a book of loans and assets. This was a book of sins. The entries were in a kind of code, but it was a code she was born to break. There were names: Maud Kerrigan, Pike Holleran, half the town council, and next to them, dates and amounts and cryptic notations. Then she found it, a recurring entry, logged against multiple accounts, including a historical one under the name J. Vale. The notation was always the same, L27, and in the margin, next to Jonah's entry, 3 words, hastily scrawled, date transfer fee. A cold, vicious satisfaction washed over her. This was it, the mechanism of the crime, the name of the fee they charged to forge a man's future. She was about to search for more when she heard it. A sound from the front of the bank, a key. scraping in the main door lock. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. The meeting wasn't supposed to end for another hour. Rowan's diversion had failed. The clock ticked, a mocking, leisurely sound. Tick, tock. There was nowhere to run. The only way out was the window she'd come through. She shoved the gray ledger back into its hiding place, replaced the floorboard, and scrambled for the only cover available, the deep, suffocating shadow behind the heavy velvet curtain that covered the bookshelf. She pressed herself flat against the wall, her heart a wild drum against her ribs, praying the darkness would hold her. The office door opened. Horace Lyle stepped in, his face illuminated for a moment by the lamp he carried. He was not smiling. He looked agitated, angry. He closed the door behind him, plunging the room back into near darkness, save for the unsteady circle of his lamplight. Etta held her breath. Convinced he could hear the frantic pounding of her own heart, he moved to his desk, setting the lamp down. He seemed to be searching for something, his hands rifling through the papers on his desk. He muttered to himself, a low stream of curses. That damn rancher thinks he can play me. He clearly hadn't found what he was looking for. He straightened up, his gaze sweeping the dark room. For a terrifying second, his eyes seemed to pass directly over her hiding place. Etta felt a scream building in her throat and swallowed it down. Then, Lyle turned away and walked to the large iron safe. He knelt, his back to her. Etta peered through the tiny gap between the curtain and the wall. She could see the safe's combination dial clearly in the lamplight. Lyle began to turn it. His movements were quick, practiced. Etta's mind, sharpened by adrenaline, became a camera. She didn't see numbers. She saw the symbols on the dial, a series of small, etched gears. He turned it right, 2 full turns, stopping on the symbol of a large, 8-toothed gear. Left, 1 full turn, past the 8-tooth, to a smaller, 5-toothed gear. Right again. Stopping on a symbol of 2 interlocking gears, he pulled a small, hidden lever below the dial. There was a heavy, satisfying thump from within, and he pulled the massive iron door open. He reached inside and pulled out not a ledger, but a small, locked cash box. It was this he seemed to be after. Just as he was closing the safe door, a sound cut through the night. A low, 2-note whistle. The nightjar. Olin's signal. Danger. Lyle froze. He had heard it too. "Who's there?" he hissed, turning toward the alley window. Then, the whistle came again. But this time it was different. A series of short, sharp, frantic bursts. It wasn't just danger. It was imminent danger. Someone was coming, and they were coming now. Lyle moved quickly to the window, peering out into the snowy darkness. In that moment, with his back turned, Etta knew she had one chance. It was insane. It was suicide. But it was the only move she had left. She burst from behind the curtain, a silent, dark blur. She didn't run for the window. She ran for the small telegraph key that sat on a side table, its wires snaking through a hole in the wall. Her mind was a maelstrom of fear and calculation. The secret ledger was hidden. The safe combination was memorized. But she had no physical proof, nothing she could carry out of this room, except for the tapes, the original telegraph tapes. She had to find them. She saw them, tucked in a small, unlocked drawer in the side table. A spool of thin paper tape, punched with the coded language of the wire. She had no time to take them all. Lyle was turning, his face a mask of shock and fury. "You." Her fingers closed around the spool. As he lunged for her, she made a final, desperate gamble. Her other hand, the one that had once worked the railroad lines, dropped to the telegraph key. It was a reflex, an act of pure, defiant instinct. Her fingers tapped out a frantic, staccato burst, sending a message into the ether, a ghost on the wire aimed at the next station up the line. North Spire. Hold copies, stop signature forged, stop Vale. The sound of the clicking key was a machine gun in the silent room. Lyle let out a roar of rage and lunged. No longer a banker, but a cornered animal. Etta didn't wait for him to reach her. She spun. the spool of tape clutched in her fist, and threw herself toward the window. She scrambled through the opening just as his fingers brushed the back of her coat. She was halfway out when she felt a searing, white-hot pain in her left hand. The window sash, dislodged by her frantic escape, had slammed down on her wrist. She cried out, yanking her hand free. She felt the sharp, slicing bite of broken glass, but she was out. She dropped into the soft, unforgiving snow of the alley. Landing hard on her shoulder, she pushed herself up, her left hand a throbbing, fiery agony. Blood, dark and hot, dripped from her fingers, staining the pure white snow. But in her right hand, held in a death grip, was the spool of telegraph tape, the proof. Lyle was at the window, shouting, trying to force it open. A light appeared at the end of the alley. Olin's warning had been true. Someone, roused by Lyle's return, was coming with a lantern. It was over. She was trapped. Then, from the deepest shadows at the other end of the alley, a shape emerged, a horse and rider, moving with an impossible, ghostly silence in the fresh snow. Etta. It was Rowan's voice, a low, urgent command. He brought his powerful roan alongside her in a single, fluid movement. He didn't dismount. He leaned low from the saddle, his arm outstretched. "Give me your hand. Now." She scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady. She reached up with her good hand, the one holding the tape. He caught her wrist, his grip like iron. With a strength that seemed impossible, he hauled her upwards, swinging her up behind him onto the horse's broad back as if she weighed nothing. "Hold on," he roared. He spurred the roan. The horse lunged forward, its powerful hooves digging into the snow, launching them from the alley's mouth and into the deserted main street. The snow, which had been their enemy's cover, was now their own, its soft blanket swallowing the sound of their escape. They galloped through the sleeping town, a single, desperate shadow against the falling snow, leaving behind a shouting banker, a single flickering lantern, and a few bright, accusing drops of blood on the ground. They vanished into the gray, swirling darkness. The stolen secrets of Ash Juniper clutched tightly in Etta's hand. The roan tore through the darkness, its hooves throwing up plumes of fresh snow. Etta clung to Rowan, her body pressed tight against his back, the icy wind a blade against her face. Her left hand, the one she'd instinctively braced herself with, was a frozen, throbbing mass of pain. Her right hand, however, was thrust deep into the pocket of her own coat, its fingers wrapped in a death grip around the spool of telegraph tape. Behind them, the shouts from Ash Juniper were faint, but Rowan didn't slow. He knew Lyle, and he knew Pike Halloran. The alarm was raised. They would not be allowed to simply ride away. "They're coming!" Etta yelled over the wind, twisting to look back. 3 dark figures on horseback had just cleared the edge of town, riding hard, their forms stark against the white landscape. "I see them." Rowan's voice was a low growl. He was not heading for the open plains, nor for the ranch. He wrenched the roan's head to the right, plunging them off the main trail and into the rising, treacherous foothills that led to the Cinder Notch. It was a brutal, punishing landscape, a maze of black volcanic rock and steep, snow-dusted inclines. The roan, a creature of the high country, scrambled over scree and leaped small, icy creeks, its breath pluming, but their pursuers were gaining. They were not on a horse burdened by 2 riders. "They're closing the gap," Etta said, her voice tight with pain. "It's Halloran," Rowan grunted, glancing back. "He's a tracker, and he's got 2 men with him." The notch itself loomed before them, a deep, narrow cut in the mountainside, its walls sheer and dark. It was a natural bottleneck, a place where no rider in his right mind would go, especially not in a snowstorm. "At night, we go through," Rowan said. "Rowan, we can't. It's a dead end." "No," he said, urging the horse into the canyon's dark mouth. "It's a filter." The ground inside the notch was a treacherous carpet of ice-slicked boulders. The wind howled through the high, narrow gap, A mournful, shrieking sound. They were forced to slow, the roan picking its way carefully. The sound of their pursuers echoed, magnified by the rock walls. They were in the notch with them. Rowan led them to a place where the path split. The main trail continued, wide enough for a wagon. The other path was a terrifying, hairline crack ascending the eastern wall. It was barely a goat track, slick with ice, with a sheer, black drop on the right. "This is it," Rowan said. "The knife's edge. Only wide enough for one. They'll have to follow single file." "Hold on." He urged the roan onto the path. The horse hesitated, sensing the danger, then obeyed, its iron-shod hooves striking sparks from the rock. They climbed, the abyss falling away beside them, the wind trying to peel them from the mountainside. Etta's injured hand throbbed in time with her heart. The pain was a sharp, bright thing, cutting through the cold. She clutched the spool of tape tighter, the other hand gripping Rowan's belt. "Rowan," she gasped, her voice raw. "If something happens, this tape. Don't let them get it. It's Jonah's name. It's everything." Her words, a testament of absolute trust, seemed to stiffen his spine. "They will not get it," he said, his voice flat and hard as the rock around them. "And they will not get you." A rifle cracked. The sound was a sharp, deafening explosion in the enclosed space. A bullet screamed past Rowan's head, so close he felt the heat of it, and shattered a piece of rock just in front of them. The zing of the ricochet echoed down the canyon. Hollerin' Rowan cursed, instinctively. He hauled back on the reins, trying to twist his body, to shield Etta with his own. The roan, its balance already precarious, was thrown off. Its back hooves slid on a patch of wet, icy stone. The horse gave a terrified squeal, its hindquarters swinging out over the black, empty air. Etta screamed. Rowan threw his weight to the left, fighting to bring the horse back, his muscles straining. For one terrible, heart-stopping second, they hung suspended between the rock wall and the abyss. Then the roan found purchase, its front hooves digging in, and it scrambled back onto the solid path, trembling violently. "We stop here," Rowan said, his voice ragged. He urged the horse forward another 10 yards, into a small alcove where the path widened slightly. Protected by a massive, precariously balanced boulder, he swung down from the saddle. "Get off. Get behind the rock. Now." He pulled Etta down, his hands strong on her waist. Her legs were numb and she stumbled, but he steadied her, pushing her into the space between the boulder and the cliff wall. He tied the roan's reins to a small, dead shrub, pulling its head low. They crouched behind the rock, their chests heaving, their breath mingling in the frozen air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whine of the wind and the terrified, trembling breaths of the horse. "They'll dismount," Rowan whispered, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "They'll come on foot. They think they have us. Below them, on the trail." They heard the scrape of boots on rock, the clink of metal. Pike Holleran's voice, low and confident. "They're up there. Pinned. Don't shoot the woman. Boys, Lyle wants her. Creed. He's all ours." Etta's blood ran cold. She saw Rowan's knuckles turn white on the stock of his rifle. "Stay down," he ordered. They waited. The scraping grew closer. A shadow moved on the trail below, then another. They were coming, fanned out, rifles ready. Rowan didn't raise his rifle to fire. He laid it flat on the rock. He put his shoulder against the massive boulder. "What are you doing?" Etta hissed. "Closing the trail." He grunted, and he shoved. The boulder, which had rested on its pivot point for a century, resisted. Rowan's boots slipped on the ice. He set himself again, his entire body straining, a low growl of effort tearing from his throat. The rock groaned. It shifted. It rocked once, twice, and then, with a sound like the world splitting in two, it toppled over the edge. It fell for a long second, then struck the trail below with an earth-shattering crump. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, sending a cascade of smaller rocks and debris down the mountain. Completely, utterly obliterating the path. Pike Halloran bellowed in rage and surprise. "Get back! Move in that same instant!" As Halloran and his men scrambled for cover from the rock slide. Etta saw her chance. They were exposed, looking down, their attention on the slide. She grabbed Rowan's revolver from the holster on his hip. Her left hand was a useless, bloody mess, but her right was steady. She didn't aim at them. She aimed up. She fired the pistol. The shot was a deafening, echoing blast that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. Her shot, combined with the vibration of the rock slide, dislodged the true occupants of Cinder Notch. From 1,000 unseen crevices and ledges high above, a vast, screaming cloud of crows erupted into the night. They had been roosting, sheltered from the storm, and the intrusion had driven them mad. They poured down into the canyon, a living, shrieking river of black feathers, blotting out the snow, the sky, and the men below. It was chaos. The men shouted in terror, swatting at the birds. Their horses, left untended, screamed and bolted back down the trail. Through the flapping, screaming pandemonium, Pike Halloran's voice rose, thick with fury. "Creed, you hear me? Creed, this ain't over. You think that tape will save you? I'll see you at the water auction next week. I'll be there. You and your woman, you're dead. You're both dead." The sound of the birds, and the men, and the fleeing horses, faded, swallowed by the wind and the notch. Silence returned. A heavy, profound silence, broken only by the falling snow. It was over. They were gone. Etta sagged against the rock wall, the heavy revolver slipping from her numb fingers. The adrenaline that had held her together, that had made her a warrior, drained away in a single, icy rush. She began to shake. It started in her knees, then her shoulders, until her whole body was vibrating, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they would break. It was the cold. It was the fear. It was the agonizing, throbbing pain in her hand, which she could now see was soaked in dark, steaming blood. Rowan turned, his rifle still in his hand. He saw her, pale and shaking, and the fury in his face melted. He dropped the rifle, stripped off his heavy canvas duster, and in one swift movement, wrapped it around her, pulling her tight. "It's done," he said, his voice rough. "They're gone. You're safe." The coat was incredibly warm from his body heat, smelling of pine, leather, and him. It was a solid, grounding presence in the swirling, icy world. He put his arm around her, supporting her. "There's a place, a small cave, just above here." He led her, half carrying her, up the last few feet of the trail, the horse following nervously behind. It was barely a cave, a shallow overhang in the rock, but it was sheltered from the wind. He settled her on a dry patch of ground, his coat still wrapped around her, and set to work, with the practiced, economical movements of a man who had spent a lifetime surviving in the wild. He gathered dry brush from deep within the crevice and, using his flint and steel, sparked a small, bright fire. The flames leaped up, a tiny, defiant beacon of warmth in the vast, cold darkness. The light danced on the cave walls, illuminating their small sanctuary. Rowan turned to her, his face grim in the firelight. "Let me see your hand." She obediently held it out. In the flickering light, it looked terrible. A long, jagged cut ran from her wrist across her palm, the glass having sliced deep. It was still weeping blood. Wordlessly, he took his canteen and a clean kerchief from his saddlebag. He poured a small amount of water onto the cloth, his movements surprisingly gentle. He knelt before her and began to clean the wound. His touch was rough, but exquisitely careful. Etta watched his face, the hard lines softened by the firelight, the absolute focus in his eyes. She watched his calloused, scarred fingers, the fingers of a rancher, a marshal, a killer, move with the tenderness of a surgeon. "I thought," she whispered, her voice trembling, "that I was invincible, that just because I was right, I couldn't be hurt." She let out a small, broken sound that was almost a laugh. "I was just stubborn. I I didn't even think about the glass. He didn't look up, just concentrated on his work, tying the kerchief tightly around her hand, fashioning a clean, secure bandage. He finished the knot, but he did not let go. His hand, warm and strong, held hers. He finally raised his eyes. They met hers in the firelight. The air was thick with the things they had survived: the chase, the shared fear, the intimacy of the fight. The barriers were gone, burned away by the gunfire and the cold. The world had shrunk to this small, warm space, to the sound of the wind outside and the crackle of the fire within. He was very close. He had never looked at her like this. It was a look of raw, unguarded reverence. He leaned in, his gaze dropping for a moment to her lips, then back to her eyes, asking a silent question. Etta did not pull away. She did not breathe. She met his gaze, giving her silent answer. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not the urgent, frantic kiss of two people who had just escaped death. It was a kiss of profound, desperate recognition. It was slow and deep and tender. It was a kiss of gratitude, of respect. It was the taste of snow and cold air, the faint metallic tang of his canteen, and the promise of warmth. It was a long, gentle confirmation that they were both, against all odds, still alive. He pulled back, but only an inch. His forehead rested against hers. His thumb stroked the back of her bandaged hand. After this, he whispered, his voice thick, his breath warm on her face. After the auction, after we make justice speak. Etta closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, the fire, the safety. She had never felt so solid, so real. After justice speaks, she agreed, her voice a quiet oath in the darkness. Then, we will talk about what is left. The main square of Ash Juniper was a sea of grim, anxious faces. It was not a celebration, it was a reckoning. The falling snow from the night before had ceased, leaving the world starkly white. The air so cold and still that every sound a cough, the stamp of a boot, the jingle of a harness was sharp and distinct. The entire town had gathered, forming a wide, silent circle around a makeshift platform, the bed of a large freight wagon that had been positioned in front of the bank. This was the day of the water rights auction. Horace Lyle stood on the platform, his fine suit and overcoat a stark contrast to the rough-spun wool of the ranchers and townsfolk below. He was not the obsequious host today. He was the voice of the law, the arbiter of finance, and he held a sheaf of papers in his gloved hand. Beside him, looking not at the crowd, but at the Creedlands to the south, sat Maud Kerrigan. She was the picture of calm, victorious entitlement. Rowan Creed and Etta Vale stood at the edge of the circle, near the front. They were alone. The whispers that had followed them for weeks had now become a wall of silent, communal suspicion. Etta's left hand was conspicuously wrapped in a clean white bandage, a stark symbol against her dark wool coat. Lyle cleared his throat, his voice unnaturally loud in the cold. Thin air. We are gathered, as per the territorial statute, to auction the primary water rights of the Cold Prayer Spring, said rights being collateral against a defaulted note held by this institution against the property of Mr. Rowan Creed. He looked down at his papers, a shadow of a smile on his lips. The floor is open. I have one preliminary bid, submitted in writing, which meets the full, outstanding value of the note, a bid from Mrs. Maud Kerrigan. A low, angry murmur passed through the crowd. This was not an auction. It was a coronation. This bid, Lyle continued, has been reviewed. All paperwork has been found to be in perfect legal order, and the bid is hereby entered as the official baseline. Do I have any— You do not? Rowan's voice cut through the square. He stepped forward from the crowd, his gaze fixed not on Maud, but on Lyle. He was not the weary, solitary rancher. He was the man from the saloon, the ex-marshal, his voice a quiet, iron authority that made the entire square go utterly silent. Mr. Lyle, Rowan said, his voice calm. This entire proceeding is predicated on a single fact, a defaulted note. A note you claim was due on a date I dispute. Lyle's face tightened. Mr. Creed, this is hardly the time or the place. The matter is settled. The paperwork is clear. Then it should be a simple thing to clear it for the public, Rowan countered, taking another step. As this is a public auction, I demand the originating document that proves the default, the telegraphic message confirming the change in the note's due date, be read aloud into the public record. Now, this was a move Lyle had not anticipated. He was a banker, not a public speaker. He flushed, his composure cracking. That is preposterous. You know as well as I that all telegraphic communications, especially those concerning financial accounts, are matters of strict banker-client confidentiality. I cannot read your private correspondence to the entire town. So you refuse? Rowan asked, his voice hardening. I refuse on the grounds of legal privilege, Lyle snapped, regaining his footing. He was the law. He was secure. The matter is closed. The bid from Mrs. Kerrigan stands. Then, if you will not read the original, Mr. Lyle. Etta Vale's voice, clear and precise, joined Rowan's. She stepped forward to stand beside him. All eyes went to her, to this strange, quiet woman who had brought the storm with her. She looked up at Lyle, her bandaged hand held at her side, her face pale but resolute. Perhaps you would be willing to compare it to a copy. She raised her right hand. In it, she held the spool of telegraph tape, the thin ribbon of paper that had been clutched in her fist through the entire chase. It unspooled slightly in the breeze, a fragile, damning piece of evidence. Lyle's face went white. He stared at the tape as if she had just produced a live rattlesnake. That is bank property, he hissed. You are a thief. I am a bookkeeper. Mr. Lyle, Etta said, her voice rising, carrying to every corner of the square. And I am a telegrapher, and I know a forgery when I see one. You refuse to read the original. I challenge you to compare your copy to the master copy, held at the North Spire station. That is absurd. You have no— But I do, Etta said. The North Spire station was alerted to a potential forgery 3 nights ago. I asked the operator there to be present today. Mr. Abernathy. A small, nervous man in a green visor and thick spectacles stepped out of the crowd. It was the telegraph operator from the neighboring station, the man who had received Etta's desperate ghost wire message. He held a large, official-looking ledger. Mr. Lyle, Abernathy said, his voice trembling but clear. The Federal Telegraph Service takes allegations of wire fraud with the utmost seriousness. I have been instructed to retrieve your copy of the transmission in question for comparison. Lyle was trapped. The crowd was watching. Maud Kerrigan had stood, her face a mask of thunder. To refuse now, in the face of a federal operator, was an admission of guilt. With a trembling, furious hand, Lyle unlocked a cash box on the platform and produced his own logbook. He ripped the page out and handed it to Abernathy. The operator laid Lyle's page next to his own master log, which he'd opened on the wagon bed. The crowd surged forward, pressing in, a silent, judging mass. Abernathy traced the lines with his finger. He looked up, his face pale with shock. Well, Rowan demanded, they are not the same. Abernathy stammered, his voice cracking. The copy held by Mr. Lyle shows a timestamp of June 1st, but the master log, the wire was not sent until June 3rd. The date has been altered. A gasp went through the crowd. And the signature. Abernathy continued, his voice gaining a small measure of outraged confidence. The originating signature on the reply. It's a forgery, a poor one. The J and V are elongated, drawn, not written. This is not a valid transmission. This note was never legally altered. The default. It isn't real. The sound that escaped the crowd was a low, animal growl. It was the sound of a community realizing it had been duped, its trust violated not by an outlaw, but by its own custodian. This is insanity, Maud Kerrigan's voice boomed, silencing the noise. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "This woman is a thief. She broke into the bank. She is a criminal, and you are listening to her. This is a conspiracy by a failing rancher. She is right about one thing," Etta said, her voice cutting through Maud's. "I was in that office. I was there looking for this." She held up the tape. "And while I was there, I found something else. I found the real books. Mr. Lyle, who had been leaning on the wagon, staggered as if shot. Not the one you keep for the public," Etta continued, her voice ringing with cold. "Absolute certainty. I mean the gray, cloth-bound ledger, the one you keep in the hollowed-out space under your floorboards. If the forged wire was a bullet, this was the killing shot." Lyle physically crumpled. He grabbed the side of the wagon for support, his face a sickening shade of gray. The crowd roared. "A ledger." Etta cried out. "Where you log your real business, a ledger that shows a date transfer fee of $200, charged to the account of Jonah Vale. A fee for his own forgery." "Lies," Maud shrieked. "All of it. Lies." "Is it a lie, Mrs. Kerrigan, that the same ledger shows a monthly payment, in cash, to Pike Holleran? Is it a lie that the payment vouchers for services rendered are countersigned with your own personal seal? The KBN brand." Maud Kerrigan froze, her hand at her throat, her mask of superiority shattered, replaced by the raw, ugly face of guilt. At the back of the crowd, a figure had been slowly, quietly moving, melting away from the center of the square. Pike Holleran, his light brown hat pulled low, had seen the tide turn. He was a hired gun, not a martyr. He was almost to the alleyway between the saloon and the general store when a small figure stepped directly into his path. It was Olin Traynor. The young postmaster was pale, his hands shaking, but he stood his ground. "I don't think you're going anywhere, Mr. Holleran," Pike sneered, his hand dropping to his hip. "Get out of my way, boy. Before you get hurt. He's not alone." Two more figures stepped out of the crowd to flank Olin. It was Silas, Rowan's foreman, and another rancher from the High Valley, a man who had also been squeezed by Lyle's bank. They were not armed. They just stood. 3 solid, unmoving men. Pike looked at them, then at the 100 angry faces of the townsfolk now turning toward him. His hand, which had been hovering over his gun, slowly, reluctantly, rose into the air. Silas stepped forward and, with a look of profound disgust, unbuckled Pike's gun belt and pulled it free. All eyes returned to the platform, to the ruins of the town's leadership. Rowan Creed stepped forward, pushing through the crowd, and stood at the base of the wagon. He looked up, not at Maud, but at the broken, trembling figure of Horace Lyle. Rowan's face was not triumphant. It was filled with a deep, weary sadness. He was the man who had lost Elias, seeing the same rot, the same corruption, play out all over again. "It's over." "Horace," Rowan said, his voice quiet, but it carried across the now silent square. "You're done running errands for her. You don't owe her your loyalty. You owe this town the truth." Horace Lyle looked at Rowan's face, at the cold, unforgiving eyes of the marshal he had been. He looked at the faces of the people he had known for a decade, now staring at him with contempt. He broke. He slid down the side of the wagon and sat on the platform, his head in his hands, a broken, sobbing wreck. I just did what she said." He wept, his voice muffled. It was her, all of it. The water rumors, the forged wire, the payments to Holleran. It was all Maud. She said she'd ruin me, that she had paper on me from my last post. I was just a clerk. I just did what I was told. The confession, raw and pathetic, hung in the cold air. The town councilman who owned the general store, a man who had been wavering, finally found his voice. He climbed onto the wagon platform, his face grim. "This auction is a fraud," he declared. "It is null and void. All proceedings against the Creed Ranch, based on this manufactured debt, are hereby canceled. The water rights remain with Rowan Creed, He pointed a shaking finger at the weeping banker. "Horace Lyle, you are under arrest for fraud and conspiracy. Maud Kerrigan, you are also under arrest. Silas, take Mr. Holleran. Lock them in the storage room at the back of the jail until the marshal can get here from Cheyenne." The crowd began to move, to shout. A release of weeks of tension and fear. Maud Kerrigan, silent and gray-faced, was helped down from the wagon. Her reign over the basin finished. In the center of the chaos, Rowan and Etta stood, untouched. The storm had passed. Etta stepped away from him, into the small, clear space at the center of the square. She looked up at the sky, her bandaged hand at her side. The crowd, sensing a final act, grew quiet again. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Her voice, when she spoke, was not for the crowd, but for herself, for the ghosts of the past, for 3 years. She said, her voice clear and strong, "A good name has been missing from the ledgers of this territory, a name stolen by a lie, by a drop of ink on a false wire, the name of Jonah Vale." She looked at the councilman, at the shattered door of the bank, at the entire town that had been complicit in its silence. "I want his name," Etta declared. Returned to its page. There was a long, profound silence. The only sound was the drip of melting snow from the eaves. Then, from the back, one man began to clap. It was Olin Traynor, then Silas, then another, and another, until the entire square, the entire town of Ash Juniper, was filled with the sound of a thunderous, redeeming applause. It was a sound of justice, a sound of truth, and a sound of a name. Finally, brought home. That night, the storm had passed, taking with it the town's rage and fear, leaving behind a world scoured clean. The sky over Crow's Ladder Ridge was a vast, deep indigo, polished to a brilliant shine and punched with 1,000 cold, sharp stars. The wind, which had howled through the notch, was now just a soft, mournful song in the pines, a gentle sigh of a world settling back into peace. Inside the main room of the ranch house, a fire burned hot and bright in the stone hearth, its flames casting a warm, dancing light on the log walls. The chaotic remnants of the day, mud-caked boots, wet coats, the tension that had lingered in the very air had been cleared away. The house was quiet, insulated from the immense, cold silence of the basin outside. It was a sanctuary. Rowan stood by the fire, watching the flames. He was no longer the ex-marshal or the embattled rancher. He was just a man in his own home, the deep lines of weariness on his face softened by the firelight. He turned as Etta entered the room. She had changed into a simple nightdress, her bandaged hand held carefully at her side. Her hair was unbound, a dark auburn cascade over her shoulders. The firelight caught the red glints in it, making it seem alive. They did not speak for a long moment, simply stood in the warm, comfortable silence. The battle was over. The words had all been said in the public square. What was left was for them. Rowan moved to the small table by the window where Etta had done her work. He was holding her leather sewing box, the one she had carried with her from the stagecoach. It was a worn, handsome thing, its surface scarred with the marks of a long journey. He ran his hand over the lid, his touch surprisingly gentle. He placed it not on the floor, not tucked away in a corner, but squarely in the center of the table, as if it were a priceless vase, a centerpiece that belonged. He looked at her, his eyes dark and serious in the firelight. "From now on," he said, his voice a low, rough sound, "there's something of yours here, too, a permanent place." It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of fact. It was an anchor, a quiet acknowledgement that her journey had ended here, in this house, with him. Etta walked to the table and touched the box, her fingers tracing the familiar patterns of the worn leather. This small object contained the entirety of her past life, the needles, the threads, the thimbles. It was all she had left of her mother. Now, it had a home. She looked down at her good hand, turning it over. studying the lines on her palm as if they were a map she was only just now learning to read. A small, slow smile touched her lips, a smile of such profound, quiet relief that it seemed to light her from within. It was a smile that finally reached her eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. She looked up at Rowan, her gaze direct, and filled with a trust that was absolute and unwavering. Her voice, when she spoke, was the same soft whisper he had heard on that first night, but the meaning was entirely new. "Undo my buttons," she breathed. It was not a challenge. It was not a question. It was not an offering born of desperation. It was a quiet, certain statement of arrival. It was an invitation not into her body, but into her peace. It was the final, whispered word of a story that had ended in the town square, and the first word of a new story, beginning now. Rowan crossed the room and stood before her. He did not move with haste. He sat on the edge of the bed, the same spot where he had sat that first night. But he was not the same man. The hesitation, the guardedness, was gone. He was calm, his presence filling the room not with tension, but with a deep and certain peace. He looked at her, his eyes asking the final question, seeking the final consent. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Only then did he reach for her. His hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of hard work and hard fights, were impossibly gentle. He did not fumble. His fingers moved with a slow, deliberate reverence. He undid the first small pearl button at her throat. His touch was feather-light. A question. He undid the second. Each button was a word in a slow and sacred language, a quiet promise. He was not undressing her. He was unburdening her. He was undoing the knots of fear and loss, and the long, lonely years she had spent fighting for a ghost. He was unlacing the armor she had worn for so long. When the last button was free, he did not pull the fabric aside. He simply placed his hands on her shoulders, his thumbs stroking the line of her collarbone. He drew her to him, and she went willingly, her bandaged hand resting carefully against his chest. They held each other for a long time, a silent, breathing eternity in the firelight. It was an embrace not of passion, but of homecoming. It was the embrace of two survivors who had finally, against all odds, found a safe harbor. They sank down onto the bed, and he pulled the heavy wool blanket up, tucking it around their shoulders, creating a small, warm world for just the two of them, shutting out the cold, the stars, and all the ghosts of the past. They lay there, face to face, the firelight painting their faces in soft strokes of gold and orange. They began to talk, their voices low whispers, a final accounting of their shared wounds. He told her about Elias, about the weight of a good man's death, a weight he had carried alone for 15 years. She told him about Jonah, about the bright, optimistic boy he had been before the bank and the wire had broken his spirit. They were not confessions, they were offerings, the last pieces of their solitary pain, given freely to the only other person in the world who could possibly understand. He kissed her then, a deep, searching kiss that was an answer to all the unspoken questions, a balm for all the old wounds. His hand found hers, their fingers lacing together, a perfect, seamless fit, their breathing synced, a slow, easy rhythm, the rhythm of two people who had finally stopped running. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped. On the far log wall, the flickering light cast their two distinct shadows. As he drew her closer, as she melted against him, the two shadows blurred at the edges, softened, and then merged, becoming a single, graceful shape, a private, gentle union, a testament to the quiet, profound intimacy of the moment, a truth that needed no further illustration. Later, as they lay in the quiet warmth, her head resting in the hollow of his throat, her cheek against the faint, silvery line of his scar. She spoke, when Justice spoke today. She whispered, her breath warm against his skin. When they said Jonah's name, I heard him smile. For the first time in years, I heard him smile. Rowan's arm tightened around her, holding her fast. He pressed his lips to her hair, his own voice a low, rough murmur in her ear, and when you stepped forward, he whispered back, when you faced them all down. I heard my own heart come home. Outside the window, the prairie wind sang its low, lonely song, but it was a song of peace now, not of desolation. Inside, they held each other, a quiet, powerful affirmation. This was not a moment of surrender, not a fleeting escape from the hardness of the world. It was a choice, a deliberate, conscious, irrevocable choice made by two people who had earned their peace and now chose to share it. The fire was dying down, the room filling with soft, warm shadows. Before the last of the light faded, Etta lifted her head, her eyes shining in the gloom. "Tomorrow," she whispered, a fierce, bright promise in her voice. "Tomorrow, we ride out, we find the old survey markers. We put the name Vale back on the land." Rowan took her hand, his fingers closing over hers. He brought her bandaged palm to his lips and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to the clean white linen and the name Vale Creed, he said, his voice quiet, but absolute. "If you want it." The question hung in the warm darkness, an offering of a future she had never dared to dream of, a future of permanence, of partnership, a home. A slow, radiant smile spread across Etta's face, a smile so bright it seemed to push back the shadows. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy, the smile of a woman who had come seeking justice for the dead and had found a reason to live. It was the silent, perfect, and absolute acceptance that closed the door on the past and opened the door to everything. The morning was born of cold, hard clarity. The sun, a distant, silver disk, cast long, sharp shadows across the snow-covered square, making the world look like a fresh page waiting for its final entry. The temporary courthouse had been set up in the town's meeting hall, a plain, solid building that, for one day, would represent a law far greater than the whims of one banker or the ambition of one rancher. A circuit judge, a man named Elias Thorne, a coincidence of name that sent a private, painful shiver through Rowan, had ridden in from Cheyenne. He was an old man with a face like a worn map and eyes that had seen every brand of human folly. He sat behind a simple pine table, the makeshift bench of justice. The room was packed, silent. Maud Kerrigan and Horace Lyle stood before the judge, their faces pale and pinched. Pike Holleran stood between two deputized ranchers, his usual arrogance replaced by a sullen, trapped animal stillness. Etta Vale stepped forward. She moved with a quiet, unhurried grace. In her bandaged hand, she carried the spool of telegraph tape. In her other, she held the great, cloth-bound ledger she had retrieved from Lyle's office that morning, Olin Traynor at her side as a witness. She did not speak. She simply placed the items on the table before Judge Thorne, the spool of paper, the book of sins. The judge examined the evidence, his expression unchanging. He read the statement from Abernathy of the North Spire Station. He read the sworn testimony of Olin Traynor, whose voice had shaken but never broken. He looked from the ledger to Lyle, from the tape to Maud. In the matter of the territory versus Horace Lyle and Maud Kerrigan, Judge Thorne said, his voice a dry rustle of old paper, "I find sufficient evidence to bind you over for trial on charges of conspiracy, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Your assets are hereby frozen." He dipped a pen in an inkwell and signed a document. "Let the record show the evidence is sealed." He poured a pool of hot wax onto the ledger's cover and pressed his seal into it. The sound was a soft, final thump. "In the matter of Pike Holleran," he continued, not looking up, "you are charged with coercion, intimidation of a federal officer, and destruction of private property. You will be transported to the federal prison at Cheyenne to await your trial." Pike's face went slack. He had expected a local jail. He had not expected this. Then, Judge Thorne picked up a final piece of paper. He cleared his throat. One last item of business. He looked out at the assembled townsfolk. "By the authority vested in me, I am issuing a legal declaration. The seizure of the property formerly belonging to one Jonah Vale, executed 3 years prior by the Ash Juniper Bank, has been found to be predicated on a fraudulent and criminally altered document. Etta's breath caught in her throat. Therefore, the judge's voice rose, filling the silent room. Said seizure is declared null and void. The deed is to be immediately restored to the Vale estate, or, should the land have been sold, full and fair market compensation is to be paid from the frozen assets of the guilty parties. The record is hereby corrected. It was done. A crime committed in the shadows, a name erased by a lie, had been brought into the light and made whole again. There was no applause. There was only a deep, collective intake of breath, the sound of a community holding a moment of profound, undeniable truth. Rowan and Etta turned and walked from the hall. As they stepped out into the brilliant, cold sunlight, they found that the world had changed. The townsfolk were no longer a suspicious, murmuring herd. They had formed two silent, solemn lines, creating a wide path from the courthouse steps to the main street. They were the men and women who had whispered, who had doubted, who had been afraid, and now they stood in silent tribute. As Rowan and Etta passed, no one spoke, no one reached out. They simply watched, their faces a mixture of shame, respect, and a dawning, fragile hope. This was not a celebration of victory. It was a quiet, communal act of bearing witness. Justice had been done, and they were marking its passage. Rowan and Etta walked with their heads held high, but their faces were not triumphant. They were somber, their eyes fixed ahead. They moved not as conquerors, but as survivors who had paid a high price for the peace they had won. At the bottom of the steps, Etta paused. The clerk handed her the official, newly stamped document that restored her brother's name to the land. She took it, her fingers tracing the fresh ink. She looked not at the crowd, not at the sky, but at the paper itself, as if it were a direct line to the past. "Jonah," she whispered, her voice a private, heartbroken prayer of thanks. "Brother, I have your name back." Rowan turned, not to her, but to the people of Ash Juniper. He did not raise his voice. He spoke to them as a neighbor, as one of them. "They can try to choke off your water," he said, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "They can falsify a ledger. They can change the date on a wire. They will always try, but they cannot change who we are. Not when we stand together." He was not speaking of himself. He was speaking of all of them. He was handing the future of the town back to them. From the doorway of the courthouse, the prisoners were led out. Maud Kerrigan, for the first time in her life, was silent. Her face was a mask of stone, her eyes fixed on the distant, indifferent mountains. She had built an empire on fear, and now she had nothing. Horace Lyle, his hands bound in front of him by a short, rattling length of chain, could not meet the gaze of the people he had betrayed. He kept his head down, his face hidden in the shadow of his hat, a man utterly defeated by his own cowardice. The faint clinking of his chains was the only sound. At the edge of the crowd, Olin Traynor, the boy who had become a man, slowly, reverently, removed his hat. It was not a gesture of celebration. It was a gesture of profound respect. Across the square, another man did the same, then another. There was no cheering, no shouting. There was only the solemn, powerful silence of a town paying its respects to the hard, unglamorous work of justice. Rowan turned back to Etta. She was still looking at the paper, a single tear tracing a path down her cold cheek. He did not wipe it away. He simply bent his head. He took her bandaged hand, the hand that bore the scars of their victory, and he gently, reverently, kissed her fingertips, a silent public vow that bound their shared past to their shared future. It was a testament to a victory won not by a single gun, but by a partnership of courage, of love, of two solitary souls who had found their strength in each other. The heavy oak door of the courthouse swung shut behind the prisoners, the sound a final, decisive thud that echoed across the square. It was the sound of a chapter ending, the sound of a cage being locked, A gust of wind blew down the main street, catching the town's simple flag and snapping it taut, as if wiping the last of the dust and deceit from its name. Rowan and Etta stood for a moment longer in the silent, respectful crowd. Then, they looked at each other. No words were needed. Everything that had to be said had been spoken in the dark of the cave, in the warmth of the fire, in the quiet of the ranch house, together, without looking back. They turned and began to walk, their steps in perfect sync. They walked away from the town, away from the courthouse, away from the ghosts and the lies. They walked toward the high, wind-swept promise of Crow's Ladder Ridge, the place where they had, the night before, finally, irrevocably, chosen home. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories. 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help more people discover it. Your support means the world to us.